All right, nerds, we are back in the nerd zone, and I have a guest who I have been bugging to come on to the show for a long time, and it is none other than Congressman Dean Phillips, who I had the pleasure of volunteering for a few weeks in New Hampshire and volunteering kind of remotely thereafter. Welcome to the show, Congressman.
Great to be with you, Tom. You weren't bugging, just more of a velvet hammer.
I was like, I bet if I keep asking periodically, he'll eventually realize, like, okay, yeah, might as well just go on.
I mean, I'm sure you would agree that if I've learned one lesson in life, he or she who is persistent wins. Period.
Always.
Period.
That's what I tell my kids.
Oh my gosh, the number of people that give up after one unreturned call or one unreturned email or text. I mean, little do people know. At a certain point, you get so annoyed with them that you will give them time. So that's everybody. I hope you're listening.
Yeah, and certainly in the private sector, if someone's really politely persistent and thoughtful about it, you're like, well, shoot. I mean, if they were on my team, then maybe they'll be advocating for my company in the same way.
Exactly. Fine line. Yeah, in Yiddish, there's a word nebbish, which is when you've crossed the line of being persistent to just being downright annoying. You don't want to be a nebbish.
Yeah. I think that would be more like I have an older brother who probably goes right at that line. He's a very, very successful sales guy, so I can't knock him. But I would say I've seen
he's
that.
A nebbish.
Yeah, he's a little bit nebbish. He's always saying, "Hey, don't ask, don't get," and all that kind of thing. Well, let's start off with how are you doing? Like, what's life like after the campaign? Like, how are you holding up? What are you working on these days?
Well, thanks, Tom, and thanks for having me on and for everything you've done. And I've been doing well. For everybody watching right now, you can imagine when you go from 100 miles per hour to about 10 miles per hour that quickly, it comes at a little bit of a cost and a lot to wrap up. I'd never endeavored running for president before, did not plan on it, did not have much time to set up a campaign, which made it even more complicated to get up and running and then also to shut it down. And then there's the personal element, which is, I gave it my best, but the structure of this industry made success almost impossible, as you well know. And it was frustrating, but I got to tell everybody that, I learned a beautiful thing about the country, that the overwhelming majority of Americans are remarkably decent and thoughtful and considerate. And we have this industry, angertainment, that I call it, that is really having us believe that we are irretrievably divided and we're heading for disaster. And I think there's an element of the campaign that really gave me a chance to discover America and Americans in different parts of this country that really made me optimistic again. So there's a part of me that has been really re-energized. You can imagine returning to the most dysfunctional, ridiculous Congress maybe in American history has not been easy. You saw the exchange between Marjorie Taylor Greene and some of my colleagues the other day. It's hard to really, you can't make it up. And that's frustrating. The Congress is so just so dysfunctional that it's frustrating. Part of me feels like second semester senior year of high school, where I'm not running again for Congress, and I can kind of pick and choose what I want to do. And not that I'm playing hooky, mind you, but a little bit liberating. But then there's the frustration too about the system, and you and I have spoken about this. That the duopoly, the Democratic and Republican parties are corporations. They act like it. They have their own interests. They pursue them. They are not looking out for the general public. They're looking out for their own. And despite being a Democrat and a proud Democrat, I left that experience, Tom, deeply dismayed and disappointed and concerned about how few of our fellow Americans, I think, really understand, how messed up and how dysfunctional and frankly, how corrupt I think our political system is. I'm not talking about one party or the other. I'm talking about the system. And those are the things on my mind right now. Looking forward to a new chapter, but a lot of contemplation, reflection, and consideration about how I can be helpful, perhaps in the near future.
Yeah, I was looking at the New York Times Siena poll. One of the things that struck me was how many people were feeling like there's a need for major change,
Yeah.
and not sort of like incremental change. And it explained a little bit of why it seems like President Biden is still struggling to overcome some gaps in those key swing states, that
Hmm.
people don't see him as a agent of change,
Yeah.
really.
Right.
And Trump, for all of his issues, which there are innumerable, does bring a bit of a chaos candidate vibe, and you're like, well,
Mhm.
maybe he'll just blow up the whole system.
Yeah.
uh, kind of attraction to him, I guess, for some people.
Hmm.
I'm curious. You're not running for re-election for
Right.
Congress, right? Was that a hard call, or I mean, I guess now you could, or how did you think about whether to serve another term or to
Yeah.
come back to Congress?
Well, it was a hard call because I really do find this service joyful, more often than not. The hardest thing I've ever done. It's consuming. It takes a massive toll on oneself and one's
Yeah.
family, one's relationships, and that's something that's complicated. There's no question. It's a very difficult job to do well. It's a particularly difficult job to do well in this environment. And I really, I struggled with that decision. But I also, as someone who's advocated for term limits, who believes that it's great to have new people, new ideas, to open up opportunities for new generations, that I've always advocated for term limits for that reason. And it felt like it was time. I had set out to be part of the resistance after the 2016 election. In a handful of years, I became a member of House Democratic leadership, and tried to offer Americans a choice in a presidential election, and became the ranking member of the Middle East Subcommittee on Foreign Affairs. Had some extraordinarily beautiful moments and some deeply troublesome ones. But in a way, I did what I set out to do, which is to serve my country and do it over 3 terms, and now turn it over to somebody else who I think is going to be remarkable. So I'm actually really excited, and I'm not going to leave public life altogether. But I don't like leaving anything. Anybody that leaves a job or moves homes or cities, there's a little bit of nostalgia and sadness involved. But I'm really excited. And I just think that we shouldn't have people serving for 20, 30 years in Congress. I think it should be more like, 6 to 10.
Yeah. I've said this on my show before. I am in the 16th district of California,
Mhm.
and our current congresswoman is in her 15th term and has never been really challenged.
Right.
And so it took her deciding to retire, and then 12 amazing candidates announced the next day,
Yep.
from all generations. Some people, well under the retirement age,
Yeah.
which is so exciting.
Hallelujah.
But you wonder, like, well, why did it take 15 terms? Well, it's because, she basically had it until she wanted to retire.
Yeah.
And that's just the way that system works. So,
Yeah.
what was it like coming back to Congress after suspending the campaign? I know you were kind of in the doghouse with
Yeah.
the Democratic Party. Did they welcome you back, or are you like kind of, persona non grata? Like,
Yeah.
what is it like?
Well, let me first go back to about someone serving 15 terms, and I'll talk to you about what it was like coming back. Because a couple of little stories, there are a lot of members that are in that zone. I've talked to a couple of the more mature members, and and just sitting on the House floor, what are your plans? You're running again, and I've had a couple of them to say, yeah, I just don't know what else I would do, that kind of, which is disconcerting. I had a funny moment with former Speaker Nancy Pelosi. She came up to me right after I got back after the campaign. I was sitting on the House floor during votes, and she came up and she said, "Dean, I just heard you're not running again. Are you kidding?" And I said, "No, Madam Speaker, I'm excited to move on, and it's time." And she said, "No, you can still register in Minnesota up until June 3rd. I mean, by the way, she's 83, Tom. She knew the date off the top of her head, or I just learned whatever it was. She knew when the date was." And I said, "Look, Madam Speaker, no, it's time. You're going to love my replacement. She's outstanding. By the way, a former classmate of mine from all the way back to 4th grade, I think, is going to win my seat." But it just didn't comport with her that I would, forego a entire career in Congress. And I didn't say it, but I was thinking this is kind of the whole point. We should be here for a bit and do what we can do, and then turn over. Because in 30 years, Tom, that's probably three members of Congress serving 10-year terms, 10 years of their career. So that's that. Getting back to Congress after the campaign was, I was concerned about how I'd be received. One of the first tweets I saw from one of the Washington reporters was something that said basically, Dean Phillips, welcome back to the House floor with high fives, hugs, and handshakes.
Oh, wow.
And then it said ... by the Republicans. So let me start with that. I learned something, Tom, because my Republican colleagues, many of whom I'm actually quite close with, they really saw what I did as, take the politics out of it. They really saw it as an act of courage. They know more than anybody the risks of going against your party, but particularly going against an incumbent president. They know if they had even whispered something negative about Donald Trump, they would be eviscerated. So they greeted me with this sense of awe of just the most extraordinary gesture of courage, and I literally did. I had people come up to me who I've never even visited with, just expressing some congratulations. With that said, on the Democratic side, there were some people who were just really disappointed, and had said a couple unfriendly things in the press. Only a handful, by the way. And I knew who they were, and they would be the ones that would keep their head down when I passed them in the hallway. Most of my friends, colleagues were remarkably kind. But what's happened in the last few weeks, especially since that last time Siena poll, Tom, is I've had a number come up and say, Dino, I got to tell you, I was really pissed when you did this, and did not even contemplate that we could be in the position we are in now. But the fact of the matter is, you know what? You saw it before we did. And I'm not there to say I told you so, or that doesn't feel gratifying, but I've had a lot of people that kind of understood now what I was trying to do, which, Tom, as it was needed to shake it up, and needed to put pressure on the Biden campaign to wake up, to recognize that 30% of the country right now doesn't want to vote for either of these men. It's a big deal, and I'm getting a little bit more of that gratitude, at least, for doing something that many recognize now probably should have been done by others as well as me. So, but it's been challenging. I'm not going to lie. When you're a lame duck member of Congress, not running again, when you took on your party, it doesn't exactly make you the most valuable member of the team. And I feel that, but I didn't run for office to be part of a team. It's Team America. I ran for doing what I think is right. And part of my problem is that we act too much like teams, fighting each other instead of one team working together. So I feel liberated and inspired, and able to say and do whatever the heck I want in the spirit of principle and truth. And I'm going to keep doing it, much to the dismay of many of my colleagues. Lastly, you may have seen Henry Cuellar, my Democratic colleague from Texas, was indicted, federal indictment, for essentially working on behalf of the Azerbaijanis. And the day it came out, I said he should resign. And I took heat from members of my caucus in Congress again, for being the only Democrat saying that another Democrat should resign. But he should. Bob Menendez should resign. The bar for federal indictments is high. I think the feds win like 95+% of their cases, because it is a very high bar. And I'm really sick of corruption and unethical behavior on both sides, and I'm going to call it out. So I'm not making more friends, but I think I'm making the right enemies.
Yeah, it seems like the folks who are willing to challenge their own party, it doesn't end with them getting great promotion and more power. Like,
No.
I feel like Mitt Romney's kind of in a similar category. He's kind of all by himself, like in the wilderness.
Yeah. And that's to me the fundamental problem in American politics right now, is that we are, I think, members of Congress, I shouldn't say politicians are increasingly beholden to their tribe, to their party, not beholden to the Constitution, not beholden to their constituents. They're beholden to the media environment. They're beholden to the fundraising game and building your national brand. You're beholden to climbing the ladder of your career. and they're beholden to party. The sad truth is you do not become an influential member or a leader on either side of the aisle unless you're willing to play by the team rules. And
Yeah.
often those team rules are absolutely incongruent with what the country wants and needs. So that's why we're going to see increasingly the people who are rising to positions of stature are going to be the ones who simply concede their principles. Look at Elise Stefanik, if you will. Look at some other members of Congress who seem to have just done 180-degree switches from reason and principle and moderation, collaboration, to becoming just shockingly partisan because they've recognized, if I want to continue this, here's how I got to play. And it's sad, but that's the reality of democracy.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember when we were in New Hampshire, we had an opportunity to have a group dinner, and we were talking a little bit about healthcare.
Yep.
And, I think one of the things you and I both agree on is like, if you show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcome.
Exactly.
And I think the same applies to Congress. Like, I look at MJT and, she seems to be having a great time. And I suspect her district will reward her for how she comports herself. And so why should she work across the aisle? Why should she try and be constructive? Like, she'll raise more money and get more attention and have more influence by, kind of being outlandish.
It's pervert. You just hit the nail on the head. Perverse incentives. We're human beings. We respond to incentives. It's like training a dog. If you do this, you get a bone or you get a treat. And in politics, in Washington in particular, the incentive is acting like a complete buffoon and being not just provocative, but being aggressively disrespectful, in some cases nuts. And the reward is raising tons of money, a lot of national attention. And right now it opens the door to ascending the political ladder. I mean, whether it's a member of House leadership or Senate leadership, or even look at the vice presidential race with Donald Trump. It seems to be people falling over themselves to act more and more ridiculous. Kristi Noem shooting her damn dog, thinking that might be helpful because Donald Trump doesn't like dogs. I mean, give me a break. The stream of people going up to New York just to sit in the courtroom so that Donald Trump sees them there. This is the audition. The incentives are shocking. And we have votes, Tom, and every day after votes, people who pass meaningful legislation, really trying to help people take their job seriously. They walk out of the House floor down those steps and they get right in their car and they go home or they walk back to the office. Marjorie Taylor Greene, she exits, and every single camera, every reporter, every one of them surrounds her. And every one of us walks past that and we think to ourselves, what are my interests? What are my aspirations? And I see more and more of my colleagues giving in to playing the nauseating game. And, and the fact is we're all part of the problem because we are the eyeballs that are following, CNN and Fox News and MSNBC and Newsmax. And we're the ones paying attention. And as long as we do that and reward them for this nonsense, it's going to get worse and worse.
Yeah, the angertainment factor is for sure, kind of contributing to this vicious cycle. I also feel like even in my district, even though it was competitive this year, it's a very in my case very blue district, and so there wasn't a lot of purple discussion. The primary was more around like who can be the most progressive,
right?
Basically. And I would imagine MJT's district is probably super red, and like, why should she try? Maybe we could talk a little bit about like what we can do as a country to change these incentives, because it's clearly we're not getting what we want out of the current system. Like nobody likes Congress.
Well, let me start with what we can do, and which is first of all, does not take an act of Congress, doesn't take changing laws. What we can all do is vote in primaries. By definition, the more people that vote in primaries,
Yep.
the more you see a moderating effect on the outcome. I mean, it's just that's what democracy is predicated on: is more participation. You generate the will of the people. And I think in my primary, we saw from 4% turnout in South Carolina to maybe 15% in a couple states, 15% max, 4%. Who are those? 5 to 10% voter bases? Those are the party loyalists, right? So you're only going to get the partisan far left or far right candidates that break through. So one thing we can all do is participate in primaries, and that is the lowest hanging fruit, the most actionable, and frankly, I think the most necessary. To your point, we act on incentives, and if you come from a deeply red district or deeply blue, and you're a moderate, you have two choices. You can knowingly be principled and lose, or you can do your best to portray yourself as a little bit more left or a little bit more right than you really are. And most times voters see through it, but the incentive is to pander to the base, because the people that show up to vote are the far left and far right. So that's another problem. And that's why we need gerrymandering reform. I think independent commission. I think a wonderful use of artificial intelligence would be the construction of our 435 districts. Now, of course, each side would argue that somehow, the data sets would be, leaning left or right or inappropriate. But the fact is, if we could have machines independently craft districts based on the parameters that we set, for the most purple, most competitive, most representational as possible, you would see by definition candidates who would be rewarded by that moderation. And now out of 435 districts, Tom, I think maybe 20 or so are legitimately competitive. I think about 410 of those districts in the next election. I mean, if you could put every single dollar you had on the outcome of those and probably not lose one, there are only about 20 that are legitimately competitive. That number should be at least half of the districts should be really competitive. And then if you were Marjorie Taylor Greene or you were, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, then they would have to actually moderate their perspectives in Marjorie Taylor Greene's to the left. And of course, AOC would have to moderate a little to the right if they wanted to win, which is the whole point, to be more representational of where the massive majority it is. It doesn't mean you sacrifice your principles, but that's what we have to do. And then lastly, I think ranked choice voting is something that will be extraordinarily helpful. Alaska and Maine have deployed it with great success. Here in my state of Minnesota, our state hasn't done it yet, but a lot of our cities have with success. Of course, more moderate candidates forces candidates to actually broaden their base of support. And I think it empowers voters and gives them a reason to come out, because your vote isn't going to be wasted. If your person doesn't come in number one, you've actually made a difference in the eventual winner, generally someone you find acceptable. So those are the three things that I think would be helpful, along with open primaries. And I don't see why those are even partisan propositions. They should just be standard. And that's something I intend to try to promote when I'm done with Congress.
Yeah, I mean, the things you're talking about, open primaries, ranked choice voting, gerrymandering reform, term limits. I'm guessing you're probably in favor of some campaign finance reform.
Oh, well, yeah, we can talk about that too.
Yeah. So those are all things that I think if you asked most everyday Americans, they would be like, yeah, that makes sense. And yet the people that are most influential seem like they have the most to lose by implementing those things.
Bingo.
Like if I have, an unfair advantage and I have like dominant market share, why do I want more competition?
Exactly. If you're Coke and Pepsi and you hate each other, but then suddenly Red Bull says, they file suit that forces them to get, 3 feet of shelf space in every store in America. Yeah. Suddenly, two arch rivals say, you know what? Your enemy's enemy is your friend, right? And that's kind of the whole point right there. Yeah. Why would you give up your advantage? And that's why the parties, when we only have two major ones, that's why I think it's a big part of the problem. I really do believe the country would be well served by a thoughtful third party that was well organized and had operations in all the states, not just at the presidential level, but started to really build a national brand of reason and decency and competency, and to triangulate the power structures in politics, because right now that duopoly is trying to protect this system because it's working well for both of them, but that's the only two entities it's working well for. And I think you just hit the nail on the head. But to break through that, by the way, remember too, we don't have state-controlled media in this country, but we absolutely have party-controlled media, and it's not by ownership, but it's by incentive. So to break through that media ecosystem is going to be very complicated. And that's why I'm pleased, like News Nation is really trying to become a kind of a more, if you will, moderate voice in media that tries to share perspectives on both sides and build a brand. And, it's going to take not just the organization and inspiration, but also a media entity that kind of promotes a new way forward. And I think that competition would be really healthy, whether you're a Democrat or Republican. I think a third party would be actually really healthy to force the country somewhat to moderation and away from these extremes.
So folks that are watching this channel are familiar with a lot of those reforms that you're talking about. It's a self-selected group of policy nerds. We love talking about that kind of stuff.
Sure.
To get like a national movement where it's not just the 5-10% kind of policy nerds, but it's the vast majority of people. I mean, right now, from what I can tell, and maybe because it's partly inflamed by kind of angertainment, but there's more interest in debating CRT than RCV for sure.
Yeah.
Even though I would argue RCV probably will affect more people's lives in the long run. I have a brother who is on a different political end of the spectrum than I am. He lives in Florida.
So he's super liberal?
Not quite. He's always asking me like, how do you feel about raising your kids in California? Like, aren't they going to take away their pronouns? And
yes.
And I was like, last I checked, their pronouns are still there. They're fine. But it's his information sources kind of rile him up. And I'm like, hey man, let's talk about campaign finance reform. And it's just, he's like, I don't want to talk about that.
Yep. Well, that's I think that's kind of that's a reflection on the human condition, Tom. We are motivated by fear. I mean, it's just baked into us because we didn't want to get attacked by the leopard we heard in the bushes or something. And it's the same thing in politics. People would rather talk about divisive cultural issues that may or may not even be legitimate or real because they're scary. And that's why the immigration issue, that's why, of course, war and threats are very attention grabbing for all of us. And that's what we want to talk about because we want to be safe. Things that are prospective and improvements don't get a lot of favorable attention, especially right now when people are feeling uneasy to begin with. And that saddens me because by definition, reforms are reforming something. They're prospective, and we don't seem to dwell on that anymore. And part of it is the age of our country. I think we've reached the summit, if you will, of our initial stage of nation building, if you will. And we're like a teenager amongst middle-aged countries around the world. And now we're struggling to look forward and to dream big and to unify behind doing better. If we're looking backwards a lot more than I feel comfortable with, and I think that's part of this question that we have about what kind of nation are we? Where do we want to go? And it saddens me that we don't have more discourse about exciting things about the future because people are so scared now about perceived threats propagated mostly by the media.
So, you listed off a number of things that I would be pretty confident would be positive for the country. Even if we got one of them, term limits or campaign finance or gerrymander reform, any of them, ranked choice voting. What's the path to getting even one of those things done in light of the fact that like the established owners of power don't want to give that reform?
I would argue, and the beautiful thing about this country, and by the way, anytime I say something or I tweet something about our democracy, of course, there's someone out there that reminds all of us that we are a democratic republic, and that's true, and that's the beauty of our system is that we can. I don't believe in federalizing everything. To the contrary, especially as it relates to these reforms, we have states that can and should be laboratories, and smaller states in particular, whether that's testing new models of healthcare provision or in this case, testing new models of electoral reforms. So to answer your question really directly, Tom, I would say that the way to do this is to identify a state that is either already doing it or has an interest and has both funders and activists. Alaska and Maine are great examples for ranked choice voting. Those are not liberal states. They're not they're the most independent-minded states in the country, which is kind of cool.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it would take a combination of both human and financial resources to inspire primary turnout. Remember, the parties do not. When's the last time you saw a get out the vote effort for a primary election? Never. They don't want you to vote in primaries. They want the party faithful to vote in primaries, so they make the easy coronation decision, right? Only in the general election do you see turnout the vote efforts. Imagine a small state, say Rhode Island or Delaware or South Dakota, where you could really get behind the notion of inspiring people to vote in a primary, just to make that model, where you can work with local leaders and state legislators to consider ranked choice voting. In Minnesota, by the way, Tom, we've been trying to pass it at the state level, have not been successful, even with Democrats in charge, by the way. But we've been very successful at having it adopted at a number of municipal levels: Minneapolis, St. Paul, I think Duluth, Bloomington, Minnesota, Minnetonka, where I am proximate right now, some of our bigger cities. And as people get accustomed to it, it starts growing and expanding. And it's like anything else. You plant the seed, you water it, and then it will grow. So I think the answer to your question is it's never going to happen in Congress.
Mm-hmm.
It will happen if it starts spreading around the country. And in the case of ranked choice voting, Georgia, of course, Republican statewide generally, they've included ranked choice voting for overseas military balloting. Glenn Youngkin, the governor of Virginia, he would never have become the nominee for the Republicans without ranked choice voting in the Republican primary. So it is not just a kind of a progressive notion. It is actually being deployed and used in states that are both red and blue and somewhat purple. And I think that's how we do it here. And I think too much attention is placed at the federal level, whereas really I think our founders wanted the states to be the laboratories. And we can test, we can improve, we can discard what doesn't work and invest more in what does. And that's where I'd encourage people to direct their attention to state initiatives.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, when I moved to California, I was encouraged that we have like this top two primary system where I think it was Schwarzenegger that pushed for it back in the day, where, just because you get the Democratic nomination doesn't mean you automatically win. At least there's a real general kind of competition. So,
that's healthy.
I'm glad that, I think the more of us, as much as we watch national news and hope like Congress does a lot of things, like it does often happen at the state level, and that's more achievable in many ways.
There's a reason they say all politics is local. I mean, starting at the city level, strong mayors get stuff done. Counties. I mean, it gets harder and harder to get things done once that circle broadens. And I think we're going to see a Congress now for probably sometime into the future that can only accomplish the bare minimum. And by the way, many would argue that that's not such a terrible thing, as long as states start picking up that slack and start testing some ideas. And that's when I say test ideas, I'm talking about relative to healthcare, whether we're talking about criminal justice reform. There's a lot of leeway states have, and I'm seeing more and more states, both red and blue, as we can tell, taking the lead now because Congress is not acting, and that's not necessarily a terrible thing. And as anybody in business knows, you deal with the cards you're dealt, and you'd make the best of them. And sometimes it means you got to course correct and be flexible. And that's why I think attention should be turning to the states and municipalities, because a lot can be done locally.
Let's shift gears a little bit, Congressman, and talk about your decision to suspend the presidential campaign. So my context is, I saw a lot of traction in New Hampshire.
Mhm.
And I saw those rooms getting filled up more and more as we got closer to the primary. And I think 19% starting from zero with pretty much no name recognition
Mhm.
and, starting at the 11th hour, like that
Yep.
was pretty good in my, kind of exceeded uh, analyst expectations, I think. What was it like? Like, tell me how you navigated South Carolina and Michigan, decide, the decision to suspend,
Mhm.
because you know, I would argue you never went in as the likely candidate, so you were
Right.
always, the underdog. Why
Right.
not remain the underdog for longer, especially since it, until the State of the Union, even now, I think Biden is still not like really killing it as a candidate.
Right.
He's not really nailing it.
Mm. Well, so Tom, it wasn't an easy decision, but I'll tell you that when you hear someone runs for president, it does, on one hand, it doesn't seem like much. You say, I'm going to run for president, you file a paperwork and you're a candidate. What most don't know, and even what I discovered, is just the extraordinary amount of human and financial resources it takes to
Mhm.
mount a meaningful campaign. When I say meaningful campaign, I'm talking about all the scheduling and the events and the fundraising and
Mm.
the preparation and the media and the travel and identifying which state and the strategy. It is an extraordinary undertaking, and it requires really a lot, and it requires a lot of money to do it, even in the most by the way, you might have seen David Trone, my colleague from Maryland, just put $60 million, 60 million into his Senate primary
Oh
in
my
Maryland,
god.
and he lost.
Mm,
And I put a lot of my personal resources in, but it was just 10% of that for a presidential campaign.
mm,
And yet a presidential campaign needs exponentially more. New Hampshire, there's no question. I mean, strategically, that was the opportunity. The president, I think, had made a big misstep by disenfranchising New Hampshire.
mhm,
Uh, Eugene McCarthy, my fellow Minnesotan in 1968, under very similar circumstances, challenged the incumbent president and got in the 40s. Didn't beat him, but came awfully close. And that entirely changed the course of the 1968 campaign. So there's no question in my mind that that was what we were banking on. To have gotten almost to 20% in a brief period of time was wonderful, but needed to do better. And when we look beyond that, South Carolina, of course, was Joe Biden's stronghold. And I will be forthright, Tom. I started to see how the game was played, and I started to see how my own party played the game, and it was deeply, deeply disconcerting. And what I recognized is that increasingly a disproportionate amount of my time, energy, and resources would have to go into fighting simply to be placed on ballots. We had to sue in Wisconsin, and we won. The Supreme Court in Wisconsin overturned the Democratic Party's refusal to put my name on the ballot. Florida, I think there's still a federal case pending. The state of Massachusetts, the Secretary of State had to overturn it. New Hampshire had to
mm,
send a letter of cease and desist to the Democratic Party. We started to see that their real strategy, in my estimation, was to take my name off the ballot, force us to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars per state to get signatures, or sue. And when you become consumed with that, even a well-oiled, very successful, well-resourced operation gets distracted. And it was a successful strategy, a despicable one, but successful. And then we turned our attention to Michigan. And I haven't told this story before, but we were ready to go big in Michigan, and partially because, of course, the president's standing
mhm,
on the left had diminished considerably because of grave concerns about Gaza. And I made a number of calls to folks in Michigan across the spectrum, including members of the Muslim community. I really wanted to show up, take some heat,
mm,
but demonstrate what leadership is, which is to not run away from it, not to send a delegate or a proxy, but to show up and engage people in conversation. I was really looking forward to it. But I'll tell you, I had to make a decision, raise millions of more dollars, dedicate a lot of time and energy and sweat and tears into the state, And right before that, I had a phone call with a mayor of a prominent city. I'm not going to name it. And the mayor told me, because I was asking if the mayor might help me do a town hall in the community. And the mayor said, well, I'd love to, very happy to do so. But I got to ask you, why is a Minnesota congressman coming to Michigan right now? And I said, I said, Mayor, I'm running for president. And the mayor didn't even know. This is a Democratic mayor in a prominent city. Said, my goodness, I got to tell you, I didn't even know you were running. That's great. Eager to meet you. So that was a little disconcerting. And then he said, well, but why would you be coming now in March? I said, well, Mayor, your primary is coming up in like 3 weeks. And the mayor said, no, it's in August. You're way ahead. He said, you're way early. I said, no, Mayor, your primary was changed and it's in March. And I got to tell you, Tom, that probably more than anything else was an indicator to me that if an engaged Democrat elected official in a pretty big city didn't A, know I was running for president, and B, didn't even know when the primary was, can you imagine how many Michiganders knew the primary was there then and me? And it really became somewhat clear that, I would be wasting people's hard-earned money, a lot of time, and that my time may be better spent simply trying to elevate the issues of importance, and talk about the things we've talked about today. And part of what I endeavored to do was to wake people up, to recognize that we don't coordinate, that we need competition, that the parties are not working for us, they're working against us. And while I wish I could have gone longer and made a bigger impact, it just became clear that I would have to become an adversarial kind of lone wolf. And that's, I'm willing to be forthright and take on personal risk when I feel the call of principle. But it's not my style just to be a complainer or an aggressive gadfly like that. And that's frankly what this race would have become. MSNBC would not afford me any airtime. Of course, national media kind of had wanted it to be a Trump-Biden rematch, and it became really complicated to see a path where I could even have the platform to make the case. And so I made the decision. And again, I took on President Biden because I thought he needed a challenge. But in light of the three leading candidates, because RFK is, I think, should be considered a major candidate. I still think that it's in the country's best interest to ensure that Donald Trump is not reelected. And I had to make a decision. And I made the one to end the race and endorse the president. He called me that day, by the way. We had a wonderful conversation. He invited me to the White House to share some perspective. I told him that I wanted to apologize for having taken him on, and probably said a few things that he may have found disconcerting. And he said, "Why are you apologizing?" He said, "I would have done the same thing," which I thought was a very cool statement. And then he called both of my daughters that morning. And I got to tell you, Tom, it was a very gracious, for a man who never uttered my name, didn't even recognize my candidacy once during the primary. He was very gracious when I did concede, and that's how we wrapped it up. But my mission continues. And by the way, I'm doing better now that I'm out of the race, collecting delegates and earning 10% plus of the vote in more states, interestingly enough. So I think it just goes to show that people clearly wish there were alternatives, and I think that was the main reason we did this.
Have you been able to take him up on the White House invitation?
We've not done so yet, but I absolutely intend to. I will accept the invitation and will ensure that it is extended, because I think there's some things that need to be shared with him, not just politically, but from a policy perspective. And what I learned on the trail, Tom, which is, I do believe the Biden campaign is just simply misunderstanding why people are frustrated and who the people they need to target with their frustration are. And I have to tell you, the economic issues, let me give you a quick anecdote. I was on a plane last week and sitting next to a gentleman who's in the grain business, and he told me that organic food sales are down over 10% in the last year. And I found that number staggering because organic consumption has
Yeah.
been growing for years, right? And and then we started talking about it, and I recognized that it is probably your food purchases are it's probably the one thing that a family can immediately adjust
Mm.
their weekly or monthly costs and reduce their expenses. So probably by if you stop shopping at Whole Foods and instead went to Aldi or something, you'd probably
Mhm.
save 25% on your groceries. And I would imagine that what I said is I think that's like a canary in the coal mine. That's something that is indicative of people having to trim their expenses, not finding other ways to do so, and that would make all the numbers make sense right now. And I think the Biden campaign has completely missed the fact that despite good macro numbers in this economy, people really are worried about their economics. And there are some things I want to share with him about that, about the border, about the crisis, of course, in Israel and Gaza, and a lot of other issues that we're right now. I'm afraid to say I don't see the president issuing any kind of a vision whatsoever. None. A lot
Yeah.
of regurgitation of what we did in the past, but people want to be inspired about what someone's going to do in the future. So anyway, I hope to take him up on that, and hopefully soon.
Yeah, I'm curious, like, do you think he's getting how would you what do you think is the quality of the advice he's getting?
I think it's
Is it
poor.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, to
I,
say more
I,
about
I
that.
I think it's poor, and I say that, Tom, because what I've discovered, and I was you hear that, and once you're Washington is a swamp, and it's like this, it's like a entirely different world, and it is. It's consuming. It's very provincial, and people can get really isolated really quickly. And the president is a good man, but he's also been doing this for 50 years. For 5 decades,
Mm,
and 5 decades in Washington, really does start to, I think, encapsulate you as it relates to just people. And when you become vice president and then president, even when you're with everyday people, they're staged events for the most part. You're not really digesting how people are feeling, and I think so. It's hard for him. I think it's hard when you surround yourself with the same people over decades who may be very smart and capable people, but when you are so Washington centric and all you're doing is looking at numbers
mm,
and focus groups, and you're not doing what I did, which is, and you were with me. You meet people. You have the most extraordinary human moments by just being in VFWs and cafes and you know in machine shops and the like. That that's where the rubber hits the road. And I just don't think that he is getting the advice and counsel from people who have their ears to that ground. Whereas Donald Trump, I mean, the truth is, he, I think, has a much better sense of where most Americans, I'm not saying where they're at politically necessarily, but I think he has a better sense of what is driving the national narratives better than the Biden team. And I think it's going to be very consequential here in November. The numbers are showing it.
yeah, I remember at the beginning of I guess 23, I was thinking, oh, he's not gonna run for reelection. This is it's a transitional administration,
Yep.
and then of course he decided to run. And I thought, like, why would his advisors tell him to do this, knowing how his approval rating was really low,
Yep.
and I think he won in a very special time
Yep.
in 2020. And then I guess part of me wonders, like, well, what's their incentive? I mean, they're in the inner circle. They want to
Hmm.
stay in the inner circle. If some other Democrat runs and gets the nomination, like, that doesn't they may not have a job.
Yeah. Tom, I think you're spot on. People underestimate how the incentives of staff, advisors, counselors. I mean, by the way, that's true through human history. Whether it's in a royal court or in the
Mm,
White House, it's the people surrounding a leader have their own agenda, and that's time proven. I think in this case, I can't say this with certainty, but I can imagine that the president did not intend to run again. It was somewhat implicit. Certainly, anybody in Congress would tell you, Democrats would have said that, none of us expected him to run again, but you can't announce that because you don't want to be a lame duck president. With all that said, Tom, I think what happened was it became clear Trump was going to run again. And some polls, by the way, every time there's a public poll released, there are probably 10 private polls done by in this case, the Democratic National Committee and whatnot. And I'm sure that those polls said what they have said since, which is that of all the well-known Democrats, that Joe Biden had the best chance of beating Donald Trump. And by the way, I believe that data. If you look at the polls with Newsom, Whitmer, Harris, Klobuchar, Buttigieg, some of the people from the last cycle. There's no question. None of them were beating Trump, but I think Biden was the one that had the best chance, even if he was a little bit underwater. And in the absence of a prominent Democrat that seemed well positioned, I suspect that both the president and most importantly his advisors, probably even his family, said, "Mr. President, if not you, we're in trouble." And I wouldn't doubt that he made that decision predicated on that data and people telling him that he was the only one that could beat Trump. He's the only one that did it once, so he's got to do it again. But the failure of that perspective is very simple, which is you're only testing well-known Democrats. In this day and age, Tom, the better, it's a blessing and a curse to be well-known. The better known you are as a politician means your brand is pretty baked, and it's very hard, even with a lot of money, to change the image and your brand. And if you're underwater politically, it's hard to come out from that. And that's one reason I ran is, I'm not a well-known name. I think I'm competent and capable, and there are many more people equally so, if not more so than I, that could have run and should have run. That's what I was trying to compel Democrats to do, because a fresh face, younger, competent, well-experienced, principled, strong, I think could have done extraordinarily well. And that's where the failure was. And that's why my contention is the Democratic National Committee did a major disservice to Democrats in the country by not encouraging, promoting, and if anything, generating a competition of candidates who may not be that well known, for America to be introduced to someone who might just be the next, successful candidate. And that's why this system is not working the way it should. And there you have it.
Yeah. I can't believe we're already 52 minutes in. Do you have a hard stop at the top of the hour?
I got about 10 minutes.
Okay. Let me go quick. I've got to ask you about a current event.
Yeah.
Which is Netanyahu in Gaza. I think you and I are on many issues. We're in agreement. This one we may not be in full agreement. I feel like the response has been very disproportionate, and I'm very uncomfortable with not only what Netanyahu is doing, but also like American complicity in that strategy by providing a lot of the arms.
Yeah.
And I actually thought you were going to be the perfect candidate for this issue. Kind of like only Nixon could open up China. Like, well, the first Jewish president could be the one that has a two-state solution. Like, it's a reason why I think Bernie has a lot of voice on this issue now, because it's like, well, he kind of can see both perspectives.
Yeah.
What is your take? Because we're now, 7 months after 10/7, which clearly was a horrific, barbaric terrorist attack, should never have happened. But we also are looking at Gaza. It's like a pile of dust right now.
Yeah. Well, Tom, it might surprise you. I feel the same. I'm horrified, and I'm appalled, and I'm struggling every day as a Jewish American, the ranking member of the Middle East Subcommittee on Foreign Affairs, someone who sat with Netanyahu twice in the last 12 months before the events of October 7th, told him to his face what I thought about his policies, his right-wing government, his settlement policies, mistreatment of Palestinians, the judicial reform, all the things that were the big news before what we're now seeing. And I got to tell you, I do love Israel. I find it to be a place that has great meaning, not just for me as a Jewish person, certainly in light of the Holocaust, but considering there's only one Jewish majority nation in the world, 150 Christian majority, I think 50 or so Muslim majority nations, one Jewish. I understand the ire of how Israel was founded after World War II, amongst many. And yet I recognize that every nation in the world, including our own, I think with very few exceptions, were founded on both bloodshed and displacement of native people. It's a sickening truth. It does not make it right. It just makes it the fact that that's how most nations are established. Anyway, I love Israel. I believe in Israel. I also believe in Israel because it is the only nation in that entire region that is progressive, that protects its LGBTQ plus population, its women, it's multicultural. Rights are afforded to people of all colors and religions in ways that not another nation in the entire region does, and I'm pleased by that allyship and shared values. With all that said, I think Benjamin Netanyahu is an unmitigated disaster for Israel, for the United States, and for humanity right now. His defensiveness of Israel itself for many years, people could understand, and I could celebrate perhaps, but what he has done in prosecuting this particular effort is abominable. And it is hard to be a Jewish person who has affection and a belief that Israel needs to be protected with reconciling that with a man who I think has lost it. And Hamas, I do believe, needs to be eliminated. Abu Mazen, the Palestinian Authority leader, believes they should. Most leaders of the world believes they need to go. But to do so with the cost of 30,000 lives and maybe 8 to 10,000 children is something that's just not just irresponsible, it's just unbearable. And I don't want to both sides this because I know that's kind of an ugly notion, but I just want everybody listening and you to know that I kind of feel the same way. And I think two things can be true at once. I think you can be opposed to Israel's actions right now, opposed to Netanyahu, but that does not make you an anti-Semite. I do wish that these protests would focus more on Netanyahu, just as I found Donald Trump to be despicable. But that did not mean that I found my country to be despicable or its people to be horrific. I found a person, and I think Netanyahu deserves that. And that's where we find ourselves, and our complicity, if you will, in it is complicated. And I understand why people are so finding it so abhorrent that we're sending weapons that are being used to essentially, in some cases, kill innocent civilians. I'm appalled. And it has been one of the great challenges of my entire adult lifetime to reconcile these very disparate feelings about wanting to protect something that I personally, and I think even for our country, find very important, but that we should be much more focused on the preservation of human life. And I think we fail too often. I think Netanyahu has failed. And I deeply, deeply want to see two states in my lifetime, and I want to see peace and prosperity, and I want to see the international community end this nonsense, invest in a Marshall Plan, and guarantee the security of Israel and Palestine. And I don't think it should be Israel's sole responsibility to protect itself. I don't think it should be Palestinians' sole responsibility to protect themselves. I think this requires an international effort, and I really hope that happens. And I just want to express empathy for people who see this on all sides, because I don't think anybody wants to see innocent humans die, and I'm sick of it.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Congressman. And I should also acknowledge that even back when we were in New Hampshire in January, I think you were very vocal about your criticism of Netanyahu.
Yep.
And the settlement policy, and the need for generational change across the board. And I hope we get a resolution or some more peace in the future. I'm curious, what is your take on President Biden's performance here? Because I'm actually I've voted for one of the two parties all my life.
Mm-hmm.
And a Democrat since Obama, since 2008. I may not be voting for either party this time. I will participate, but being in a blue state, I feel like, okay, I want to send a signal that I'm kind of tired of both of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And President Biden's, what I've heard him say is that he has ironclad support for Israel, which I'm all for Israel, but I don't like the current Israeli policies.
Yep.
And what I've heard from Biden supporters is, oh, don't worry. Privately, he is putting the screws on Netanyahu. And I'm just watching the news and I'm like, it doesn't seem to be working. There was talk of a potential ceasefire agreement, and then like that same day, Netanyahu released a statement saying like, ceasefire or not, we're going into Rafah. And it's like, well, I'm pretty sure he knew the effect that would have on the negotiations. And, we paused some aid, but, now another $1 billion of previously approved aid is on its way. What's your take on Biden? He's in a tough place. He has to straddle this position, but, do you feel like he's doing, like, how would you grade him?
Well, I'll say that, let me go away from him and just get to the realities here. If Hamas would have released the hostages, months ago, it would have put such extraordinary pressure on the Israelis that I do not see how there could not have been a ceasefire. By the way, that has been the root of this whole thing in recent months, to simply extract or to generate the release of the hostages. By the way, there are we believe 7 Americans are amongst them. And Tom, I have to say, lost in this whole, of course, we're talking about 7 American lives versus 30,000 Palestinian lives. I know it's a big gulf, but speaking as an American member of Congress representing my country, the fact that 7 Americans have been held by Hamas since October 7th is really underappreciated, and I think unprecedented that Americans have been held that number for that long. And Hamas and Benjamin Netanyahu, both of which, by the way, for different reasons, I believe need to move on and be replaced. Neither of them have an incentive to end this war, Tom. Hamas recognizes that by continuing it, by letting Israel continue it, if you will, it helps them in the battle for PR. Netanyahu realizes that if he ends it, his government and his career is probably done. So you have 2 entities that have no incentive, sadly, to really end it. That's one. Secondly, the hostages are still being held. And at the root of these negotiations, is the hostages release. And Hamas knows if they do so, then this essentially concludes, and they don't necessarily want that. So, Biden's performance, I don't see how he could have done this well in terms of generating kind of unanimous approval. He was going to either deeply offend a large pro-Israel segment of the population or deeply offend a large pro-Palestinian element of the population. I think if there's been a failure, it has been the inability to work or even force the Israelis to mitigate what I consider to be just inexcusable civilian casualties. And I do not believe that Israel targets them per se, but you can't look at these figures and look at this destruction and say that they haven't been reckless. It's just obvious. So it's heartbreaking. And Tom, I don't have a good answer for you. And I don't know how. I can tell you this: between RFK, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden, believe it or not, Trump and RFK, I think, are even more more pro-Israel, if you will. Biden is the most nuanced and I think understanding of where this has to end, which is a 2-state solution, which he's been pushing for. So these are the truths. I don't think that anybody could say his heart isn't in the right place, but I do understand why watching this terror go on is just horrifying. But of the 3, Tom, he is the most likely to be the compassionate leader that I think these times are going to need. If it's Donald Trump, I can tell you what's going to happen. I think too. So I'm not giving him a hall pass. Again, I want to see Israel thrive, but I really want to see Palestinians thrive, because I think if people have something to protect, they act defensively. The only people, it's based on the human condition, when you don't have something to protect is when you are offensive. And that's true. And I don't know why we don't use our and that's the failure. If you ask me, Joe Biden's failure is to not, during his time as vice president, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, and now president, I'm deeply saddened that he had not used more of his political equity to push for either investments in the Palestinian people or a two-state solution. And I think that might be to perhaps my foremost complaint, because without that, we are going to say we're going to see the same cycle of violence for years and years and years. And
Yeah,
that's the truth.
agree. Do you have a couple minutes for? I have
Yeah.
5 audience questions that we
Yeah,
can
sure. Yeah,
run through. Okay.
I can push just a few more minutes. So let's go.
All right.
Let's go fast though. Yeah.
From Sue, what advice do you have for
Uh,
your supporters and others who believed in your campaign?
Oh, Sue, thank you. First of all, thank you. You've been extraordinary. And look, the hardest thing when you end a campaign like this is to know how many people believed in you and it, and that's hard. And I would ask that you keep the faith and you keep pushing, and join me. I'm not sure where I'm going to take this or in what capacity, and I know we're all on the same team somehow, but to push for the reforms that I have articulated, to look to 2028. It's going to come up a lot faster than we can imagine, and I can't wait for it. And to stay connected somehow, some way. And believing in my campaign is believing in more than me. It was believing in possibilities and reformations and decency and capacity and competency and competition. A lot of C's in there. So stay connected, Sue. And I'm going to stay connected on social media. I don't know what's going to happen in 2028, but I'll be around, and I still see reasons to be optimistic. And maybe we're hitting rock bottom like an addict, and we're going to be in a position where people are going to finally start recognizing that we got to start working together. And I will tell you this, Sue, in Congress itself, with the craziness on the far right and even some on my side, it is actually, I'm feeling it. It has actually pushed a lot of us together in interesting ways that I never would have predicted, where we're suddenly saying, you know what? Why are we letting these people completely undermine this entire Congress? Why don't we start working together? And you've seen some bipartisan things happen in the last couple of months, including a discharge petition that was just passed by an uber conservative Republican from Florida, Greg Steube, with mostly Democrats the other day. And you're seeing a culture shift. So, Sue, I think there's a there. So keep the faith.
All right. Logan wants to know, he's moving to DC to work in the Department of Labor, and he wants advice on handling long distance relationships with loved ones.
Oh, Logan, man, you just hit a really tough one, because I got to tell you, there is nothing harder than that. And I will tell you, as someone who served in Congress and then this campaign, it's hard on oneself. It's hard on every relationship. And I will tell you, you hear a lot of people say, "I don't have the time." Well, at the end of the day, we make time. And I have to just tell you that if I have any regrets, it's that I prioritized the pursuit of politics. I felt that I had to, until I knew better, instead of prioritizing relationships, including my own health and well-being. So make time, compromise, and at least with FaceTime, you can kind of feel close. But there's nothing that replaces being together and being present. So quality versus quantity, but make time to get together as often as you possibly can. It's just as simple as that. There's nothing that replaces it.
Scott wants to know, what should the delegates that have been awarded to you, what do you want them to do in Chicago?
Scott, that's a really good question. And I should have an answer for you at this very moment, but we're going to let the final primaries here play out and identify how many delegates we have. We will be in touch in somehow, some way. And the Democratic National Committee has not been very communicative, I should say. And that's been very complicating. I think we have delegates from New Hampshire, from Ohio, of course, Nebraska. I don't know what the final number will be, but most of all, thank you. And there is a lot of pressure on them to ultimately just quickly become Biden delegates.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to see where I want to see what happens between now and then. I want to see what happens in this first debate between Trump and Biden. I want to see what the numbers look like. I'm not sure that this is all done yet. And I would just ask that everybody kind of keep hearts, minds, and time open and see where this goes, because I don't want to see, you may have all heard, by the way, I did say the other day that I think the Democratic convention should go back to a virtual one for reasons I think many of you can understand. It helped, I think, last time. It would certainly help this time, because I think it has the potential to be a disaster, optical disaster. And mark my words, even if it's just protests, there will be outside instigators, primarily probably from the other side, that will make this look even worse than it really is. And I'm really worried about it. With all that said, I don't want it to be an unmitigated disaster. And I think a lot can change. So stay tuned.
All right. Two more. Second to last one. Are you going to be working with Andrew in the future? Seems like you guys
Oh,
have
I
a
sure
lot of.
hope so. Andrew and I become quite close. I think the world of him. What he did in that last cycle, I think, is just extraordinary. And obviously, we have some shared ethos,
Mhm.
and we continue to be in touch. And I'll be in New York shortly, and I intend to see him and spend time together. His TED Talk has gotten rave reviews, and I think that could form the impetus for quite a platform for all of us to make the case to a lot more people around this country who are, I think, really ripe to activate. So stay tuned on that too.
All right, and this is more of a comment. We'll wrap up with this one from Martha, who is one of your
Hmm.
constituents in Minnesota, and she
Minnesota.
just she wants to say how grateful she is that you put yourself out there and that you're an independent thinker, and we need more of those in this country.
Oh, hey, well, that's awesome of Martha. I've loved every, I can't say I've loved every minute of this, but as I think about, what I felt like that morning after the 2016 election and promising my daughters I would do something, to this very moment, Tom, what an experience it has been to serve my country and been in the arena and had extraordinarily joyful moments and painstaking ones too. Thank you. And I hope if I inspired a few people to run for office someday and do this, man, I was successful. And maybe I'm just getting going, and I think all of you too. So keep the faith and keep in touch, and peace.
Thanks,
Peace.
Congressman. You definitely have inspired a lot of people, and I feel like you've made cracks in the system that will hopefully lead to change and more reform. And relative to other candidates out there, you're a teenager, so you've got decades of service
It
left
is.
in you.
It's probably the only job in America where a 55-year-old would be like an apprentice.
Seriously, you're just a babe. Well, thank you for spending over an hour with us.
Oh, my
Really
pleasure.
appreciate it, Congressman, and
I
hope that
love
we
you,
can
Tom, and
have you back.
thank you. I'd love to come back soon and stay in touch.
Likewise. Take care, buddy.
All right, bye, everyone.
Bye. All right. That was freaking Dean Phillips. Oh my God. Brings back memories. That guy has a boundless energy. When I was in New Hampshire, man, I was running on fumes after 3 weeks. I don't know how Congressman Phillips and the whole campaign team, like, they're real warriors out there. If you found this conversation interesting and useful, you might be wondering, like, how does a little channel like this exist and stay running? And part of it is because we have amazing channel members. So I do want to take a minute to thank them, and then I'm going to give you my 3 takeaways from my interview that we just had with Dean. Yeah, I have some thoughts on our conversation, but I want to do a quick shout out to our channel members before we get to that. And if you're watching this on YouTube and you want to support this content, keep this channel going, just click the join button. It starts at $1.99 a month. You can cancel any time. Our biggest supporter is Soldier One, who is a senior vice president, and he's been supporting this channel for 4 years now. So thank you, Soldier One. Then we have Kristen Slevin and Bike. Kristen's over 52 months of support back when this channel was Nerds for Yang. So OG. Then at the hardcore level, and did I mention, I hope I mentioned Bike as well. Bike is also a vice president. Then at the hardcore level, which is one level down, Gene, David, DK, Jackalego, Mr. History, Mona, Vaughn, Yang, Dean, Galessa, Jay Perrin, Dana, Jason, Daniel, Mickey Yoda, Jackson, Unkiyu. And then I'm going to scroll through our verified and then give you my closing thoughts. But these are our verified nerds, entry level, but we love them all the same. And all those channel members help us basically cover our streaming software costs, podcast hosting fees. So if you listen to audio podcasts, subscribe to Nerds for Humanity. And by the way, I'm thinking of starting a Substack, like an email newsletter, where I take these long 1-hour interviews and I summarize them into like a 5-minute read with some quotes and key takeaways. So let me know in the comments if you'd be interested. It would be free to subscribe, but it would be work for me to put those articles together. So if you think like blog post / newsletter would be interesting, which summarizes long form interviews, let me know. I'd be using some cool AI to help me make it do it a little faster, but still work. And it would take money. So I would probably rely on some of the channel member supporter donations to cover or subsidize that. Okay. What are my 3 takeaways from my conversation with Dean? Number 1 is like, that dude doesn't look like Donald Trump or Joe Biden. He's very different. And the country will get the president it deserves and the leadership and representation it deserves. I feel like we deserve more than Donald Trump or Joe Biden, obviously. And yeah, I'm kind of bummed. I mean, he's a good guy. He's a very like Dean Phillips is a center left generic Democrat who's got leadership experience, got a good sense of humor, is confident but isn't full of himself. Like, is a Jewish American who supports a 2-state solution and is critical of Netanyahu. Was willing to acknowledge that the border is in a crisis state, and yet somehow the party stamped him out, man. And it's the party is a little calcified, if you ask me. So observation 1 is like, wow, this guy could have been a contender. He started too late. That's unfortunate. If I had more time, I would have asked him, like, why didn't you start earlier? I think he would have said I was trying to recruit people with more name recognition, which is probably true. But yeah, had he started earlier, I wonder what would happen. Because I don't think he announced till like end of November, and the New Hampshire primary was end of January. So observation 1 is like, wow, what a different candidate this is. Observation 2 is I appreciate that he had a pretty nuanced and pro-Israel, pro-Palestine view. And I think he is acknowledging, in a way that a lot of elected Democrats are not, and certainly no Republicans are, the fact that 30,000 people are dead in Gaza right now, and like, this is not okay. So I think he was kind of more right than Biden and Trump on Israel Gaza. I didn't want to debate with him. Like, I'm kind of more on the Stein Sanders side, like really like no more Netanyahu. Like, you need to change your policy, or you cannot count on unlimited support. So that's observation 2. I think Congressman Phillips is probably the most reasonable guy of the 3 of them on Israel, or 4 of them, I guess, if you include RFK. And then the last thing is like, this guy, I don't think he's done yet. Which I appreciate. I mean, the question about delegate instructions, I think, was interesting. He's like, hey, let's see what happens. And then I also think like he's not going to, obviously not running for re-election for Congress, but he I think we might see him run for something again, and that'll be cool. Maybe in 2028. I mean, sometimes it takes a few shots at it. I mean, how many times has Joe Biden run for president? So those are my 3 observations. 1, very strong alternative to Trump and Biden. Too bad he suspended his campaign. Number 2, more reasonable than Trump, Biden, or RFK on Gaza. And number 3 is Dean Phillips is not retiring. I think he's got more service in him, and I think he's an ambitious guy and he wants to have a big impact on the country. So let me know what you all think in the comments below. And if you couldn't join and become a member to support the channel that way, which I understand, the next best thing you can do is give me a like and share so more people can discover this channel. And with that, I'm going to wish you all a happy rest of your weekend, and we'll see you next time. Bye, nerds.